It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Marcus Thorne laughed as he poured the wine over Arthur Sterling's hand in front of the entire country club board. The heavy scent of fermented grapes and expensive oak filled the air as the dark red liquid splashed against Arthur's skin, soaking into his cuff and dripping onto the white linen tablecloth like a fresh wound. "Oh, look at that," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily to the nearby tables where Judge Harrison Reed and several city council members sat. He didn't offer a napkin. Instead, he set the heavy crystal decanter down with a sharp clack that echoed against the mahogany walls. My hand slipped. I suppose I'm just not used to pouring for someone who looks so much like the waitstaff. Arthur didn't flinch. He sat perfectly still, the cold moisture seeping into his sleeve. He looked down at his hand, then slowly up at the man who had married his daughter. Marcus stood there, radiating the kind of unearned confidence that only comes from a tailored suit and a stolen bank account. He adjusted his gold watch, a chunky, ostentatious piece that caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, and smirked. "Don't look at me like that, Arthur," Marcus continued, leaning in so the witnesses could see his mock concern. "It's a $30 bottle, probably more than you spent on that suit. Cassie, honey, get your father a rag before he ruins the upholstery." Cassie Sterling Thorne hurried over, the sharp, frantic clicking of her designer heels a staccato rhythm of anxiety. She didn't look at her father's face. Instead, she grabbed a cloth from a nearby serving station and began dabbing at the table. "Marcus, please," she whispered, her voice tight. "It was just an accident. Dad, you should probably go to the restroom and clean up. You're making the guests uncomfortable." Arthur watched his daughter. She was beautiful, dressed in silk that his hard work had once provided, but her eyes were fixed on the floor, avoiding the quiet dignity of the man who had raised her. She was managing the optics, not the injustice. "Accidents happen when you're at the top of your game," Marcus said, patting Arthur's shoulder with a condescending heaviness. He turned back to the table, addressing the board members who were watching the exchange with a mixture of pity and awkwardness. "You have to excuse my father-in-law. He spent so many years in those dusty courtrooms, he's forgotten what it's like to be in a room where people actually matter. He's retired now, you see, living on a pittance and memories." Arthur finally spoke. His voice was low, a calm vibration that seemed to cut through Marcus's loud bravado. "It's a 1982 Petrus, Marcus, not $30, and it's a shame to see it wasted on a tablecloth." Marcus froze for a second, his smirk faltering before he let out a sharp, barking laugh. "See, this is what I mean. He's obsessed with the details of things he can no longer afford. Why don't you go find a sink, Arthur? The adults are trying to discuss the new development contract." Arthur stood up. He was a tall man, and though his hair was silver, his shoulders hadn't lost the military precision of his youth. He didn't look at the wine stain. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook and a pen. He didn't write anything. He simply felt the texture of the leather under his thumb. Across the room, near the entrance of the dining hall, a woman in a dark blazer caught his eye. Detective Alina Vance gave a single, imperceptible nod. She was holding a folder, her expression as unreadable as a closed case file. Arthur turned his gaze back to Marcus. The younger man was already busy pouring himself a fresh glass, ignoring the mess he'd made. He was the picture of success, arrogant, entitled, and utterly convinced of his own invincibility. He had no idea that the pittance Arthur lived on was a choice, or that the dusty courtrooms had taught Arthur exactly how to dismantle a man like him, piece by agonizing piece. "You're right, Marcus," Arthur said softly. "Details are important." "Glad you finally realized your place," Marcus shot back without looking up. "Now move along, you're blocking the view of the terrace." Arthur walked away, his steps silent on the thick carpet. He didn't go to the restroom. He walked straight toward the terrace doors, passing Judge Harrison Reed. The judge looked up, his eyes narrow and questioning. Arthur didn't stop, but he let the small notebook slip from his hand just enough for the judge to see the seal of the senior prosecutor's office on the inside cover. Outside, The night air was cool, smelling of cut grass and the distant salt of the bay. Arthur pulled his phone from his pocket. His hand was still stained red, the dried wine feeling like a sticky reminder of the humiliation Marcus had tried to inflict. He dialed a number he hadn't used in 3 years. "It's Arthur," he said when the line picked up. "The audit is complete. He's more careless than we thought. He thinks he's the master of this house, but he's forgotten who holds the deed." He paused, watching Marcus through the glass doors. His son-in-law was laughing again, throwing his head back, one hand on Cassie's waist as if she were just another trophy in his collection. "Start the freeze on the Thorne accounts," Arthur commanded, his voice as cold as a winter gavel. "And call the firm. Tell them the sleeping lion is finished with his nap." Arthur ended the call and looked at the wine on his hand one last time. He didn't wipe it off. He wanted to feel it. He wanted to remember the exact moment Marcus Thorne decided to treat a predator like a servant. The game hadn't just begun. It was already over. Marcus just hadn't heard the trap snap shut yet. The next morning, the scent of over-roasted Arabica beans filled the sun-drenched breakfast nook, but it couldn't mask the sharp, metallic tang of tension. Arthur sat at the far end of the marble island, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of a porcelain cup. He remained silent, a ghost in a house that still technically bore his family name on the deed, watching as Marcus Thorne paced the kitchen like a conqueror. Marcus was draped in a silk robe that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, his eyes glued to a guest list on his tablet. He didn't look up when Cassie entered the room, her footsteps hesitant. She looked tired, the skin beneath her eyes bruised with a fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. "The Thorne Foundation gala is in 72 hours, Cassie," Marcus snapped, his voice cutting through the quiet morning. "I've invited the entire executive board and Judge Harrison Reed. This isn't just a party, it's my coronation. I need the house pristine." He finally glanced toward Arthur, his lip curling in a dismissive sneer. "And that means the study needs to be cleared out. Your father's old law books and dusty files are an eyesore. I want that room converted into a temporary cigar lounge for the investors." Cassie bit her lip, glancing nervously at her father. "Marcus, that's Dad's workspace. He spent 30 years in that room." "And he spent the last 3 years doing absolutely nothing in it," Marcus countered, stepping closer to her, his shadow looming over her smaller frame. "He's a guest here, Cassie, a courtesy. Let's not forget whose name is on the letterhead of the firm that pays for this lifestyle. If the old man wants to keep his room and board, he can learn to stay out of the way of progress." Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't even look up from his coffee. He simply listened to the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, each second a tiny hammer strike against the foundation of Marcus's arrogance. He felt the cold weight of the silver letter opener in his pocket, a small, tactile reminder of the sharp edges of reality. "I'll move the files by this evening, Marcus," Arthur said, his voice a calm, steady anchor in the room. Marcus chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "Good. Glad to see the senior prosecutor still knows how to take a plea deal. Just make sure you're packed away before the caterers arrive on Friday. I don't want you wandering into the foyer in those moth-eaten cardigans while I'm trying to close a deal with the Reed family." 2 hours later, Arthur was far from the suffocating luxury of the estate. He sat in a nondescript park on the edge of the city, the air smelling of damp earth and coming rain. A black sedan pulled up to the curb, and Detective Alina Vance stepped out. She looked crisp in her blazer, her eyes scanning the perimeter with the practiced ease of a hunter. She sat on the bench beside him, handing over a thick manila folder. The paper felt heavy, substantial. "You were right, Arthur," she said, her voice low. "I ran the signatures on the Thorne Foundation's latest offshore transfers. They're professional, but they're forgeries. Marcus has been siphoning Cassie's inheritance into a private account for 18 months. He's not just arrogant, he's desperate. He's leveraged everything on a property deal that's about to go belly up." Arthur opened the folder. He saw the scanned documents, the jagged lines of a signature that mimicked his daughter's hand but lacked her soul. He felt a flicker of heat in his chest, not the wild fire of rage, but the controlled blue flame of a man who had spent his life putting people like Marcus behind bars. "He thinks he's the master of the house because he holds the keys," Arthur murmured, his eyes fixed on a forged bank statement. "He doesn't realize I still hold the mortgage, and the debt is coming due." Elena looked at him, a small, knowing smile tugging at her lips. "The freeze on his personal accounts is already in place. He won't find out until he tries to authorize the final payment for the gala. He's going to be standing in front of his high-profile crowd with a declined credit card and a paper-thin alibi." Arthur stood up, the wind catching his coat. He looked toward the city's skyline, where the Thorne corporate logo glowed in the distance. 3 days, Arthur said, his voice as cold as a winter gavel. 3 days until the Thorne Foundation Gala. Make sure the judge is there, Elena. I want the law to have a front-row seat when the ceiling falls in." He walked away without looking back, the folder tucked firmly under his arm. Marcus Thorne was busy planning a coronation, unaware that he was actually building his own scaffold. The countdown had begun, and the sleeping lion was no longer interested in mercy. 2 days later, the air in the Sterling Law Library felt thick with the scent of old parchment and lemon floor wax. Arthur sat behind the heavy oak desk, his fingers tracing the edge of a manila folder that contained the destruction of a man's life. He didn't feel joy, only the cold, rhythmic pulse of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. The heavy brass doors creaked open, and Elena Vance stepped inside. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, a sound like a metronome counting down the final hours of Marcus's reign. She looked exhausted, but her eyes sparked with the predatory gleam of a detective who had found the smoking gun. "The forensic audit is complete," she said, her voice echoing in the vaulted room. She slid a slim silver flash drive across the polished wood. Marcus wasn't just skimming. He was hemorrhaging the foundation's endowment into a shell company in the Caymans. He thought he was being clever by masking the transfers as charitable outreach to overseas educational programs that don't exist. Arthur picked up the drive. It felt heavy, weighted with the gravity of a decade-long betrayal. And the personal accounts. "Frozen," she confirmed, a small, sharp smile tugging at her lips. "I coordinated with the district attorney's office. Because the foundation receives federal grants, this falls under racketeering. The moment he tries to swipe his black card at the gala, the system will flag him. He won't just be broke, Arthur. He'll be a ward of the state." The sound of the front door slamming open interrupted them. It was a violent, entitled sound that Arthur recognized instantly. Moments later, Marcus Thorne marched into the library, his face flushed with a mixture of sweat and arrogance. He was wearing a suit that cost more than most people earned in a year, the silk shimmering under the chandeliers. He didn't knock. He simply invaded the space, bringing with him the cloying scent of expensive cologne and unearned confidence. "I knew I'd find you here, rotting away in this tomb," Marcus sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. He didn't even acknowledge Elena, treating her as if she were part of the furniture. He walked up to the desk and slammed a gold-encased watch down onto the mahogany surface. The impact made the inkwell rattle. "Cassie says you're still poking around the Foundation's books. I'm here to tell you to stop. Now." Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't even look up at the man standing over him. He simply reached out and adjusted the folder by a fraction of an inch. "You seem agitated, Marcus. Is the pressure of the gala getting to you?" Marcus let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Pressure? I'm about to be named Man of the Year. I'm the face of this city's future while you're just a relic of its past. You're a retired paper pusher who's losing his grip on reality." He leaned down, his shadow falling across Arthur's face. "Cassie is worried about you. She thinks you're becoming senile. We've already started looking at some very exclusive assisted living facilities. Somewhere with high walls and people to make sure you don't hurt yourself by asking too many questions." The rage spike hit Arthur like a physical blow, but he channeled it into a cold, hard stillness. The audacity of the man to threaten him with a nursing home while standing in a house Arthur owned, built on a legacy Marcus was currently dismantling, was the final nail in the coffin. "Is that so?" Arthur asked, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "It's for your own good," Marcus said, straightening his tie with a smirk. You've had a good run, but the Sterling name belongs to me now. I've earned it. I've built an empire while you've been sitting here reading old case files. Tomorrow night, when I'm standing on that stage, I want you to remember one thing. You're only relevant because I allow you to be." He turned on his heel, his expensive Italian loafers squeaking on the marble. At the door, he paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Don't bother coming to the gala, Arthur. It would be embarrassing for everyone if you had one of your episodes in front of the governor." He vanished, the sound of his departure echoing like a taunt. The library fell into a deafening silence. Alina moved toward the desk, her face pale with fury. "How can you let him speak to you like that?" "He's talking about committing you, Arthur. He's gaslighting Cassie into helping him do it." Arthur finally looked up. His eyes were as cold as a winter gavel. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope. It was the invitation to the Thorne Foundation Gala, embossed in gold. "He thinks he's the king of the mountain," Arthur said, his voice steady and terrifyingly calm. "He thinks the witnesses to his coronation will be his shield. He doesn't realize that a crowd is just a jury waiting for the evidence." He stood up, the movement slow and deliberate. He felt the weight of the flash drive in his pocket, a secret power that Marcus couldn't even fathom. The arrogance of the bully was his greatest weakness. He was so busy looking down at the world that he never noticed the ground crumbling beneath his feet. "Call Harrison Reed," Arthur commanded. "Tell the judge I need a private word before the opening remarks tomorrow night. I want the warrant signed and ready in his pocket before Marcus even reaches the podium." He walked to the window, watching Marcus's luxury SUV roar down the driveway, kicking up gravel and dust. The countdown had moved from days to hours. "He told me not to come to the gala," Arthur whispered, his breath fogging the glass. "But I wouldn't miss it for the world. After all, every scaffold needs an architect, and I've spent a lifetime learning how to build them." He turned back to Alina, the light from the chandelier reflecting in his eyes like a predator S. 48 hours, Alina. Make sure the cameras are positioned for the front row. I want every socialite in this city to see the exact moment the man of the year realizes he's nothing more than a thief in a borrowed suit. The day before the gala arrived with a deceptive, heavy stillness. Arthur Sterling sat on the terrace, the scent of blooming jasmine clashing with the sharp, acidic aroma of the cigar Marcus Thorne had lit without asking. He watched his son-in-law lean back in a wrought iron chair, one leg crossed over the other, the polished leather of his Italian loafers gleaming in the afternoon sun. "You look like a man who's already lost, Arthur," Marcus said, blowing a plume of smoke toward the garden. "The gala tomorrow isn't just a celebration. It's a transition. My transition. You should probably stay here. The stairs at the museum are quite steep, and I wouldn't want you to have another episode in front of the cameras." Arthur didn't flinch. He picked up his tea, the porcelain cup rattling slightly, not from nerves, but from the sheer physical effort of containing his resolve. "The cameras are exactly why I'll be there, Marcus. It's important to capture the moment a legacy is truly defined. Don't you think?" Marcus let out a sharp, barking laugh that echoed off the stone walls of the estate. He tapped ash onto the slate floor, ignoring the ceramic tray just inches away. "Legacy. You're obsessed with a past that's already been sold off. I've modernized the Sterling name. I've made it profitable. You should be thanking me for keeping the lights on in this mausoleum." "Profit is a fleeting thing when the books don't balance," Arthur replied softly. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the edge of the folded document Alina Vance had delivered an hour earlier. The paper felt heavy, a cold weight of absolute truth. "I've spent 40 years in courtrooms, Marcus. I've seen men who thought they were giants realize they were standing on glass. It only takes one stone." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with a flash of the predatory arrogance that had allowed him to climb over so many bodies. "Is that a threat? Because it sounds like the rambling of a man who can't find his reading glasses. You have nothing. No board seats, no liquid capital, and soon no house. I'm the man of the year, Arthur. You're just the man who used to be." Cassie Sterling Thorne stepped onto the terrace then, carrying a tray of refreshments. She paused, her gaze darting between her husband's smug grin and her father's terrifyingly calm expression. She noticed the way her father wasn't looking at Marcus's face, but at his throat, as if calculating the exact pressure needed for a killing blow. The silver pitcher in her hands trembled, the ice cubes clinking against the metal with a frantic, rhythmic sound. "Marcus, we should go," she whispered, her voice tight. "The tailor is waiting for your final fitting." "In a minute, Cassie," Marcus snapped, not looking at her. He turned back to Arthur, his voice dropping to a hiss. "Enjoy your tea. It's the last thing in this house you can truly call yours." He stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke blazer, and strode toward the house without a backward glance. He didn't see the way Arthur's eyes followed him, not with anger, but with the clinical detachment of a surgeon about to make the first incision. Once the roar of Marcus's SUV faded down the driveway, the terrace fell silent again. Arthur pulled the document from his pocket. It was the warrant, signed by Harrison Reed, the ink still smelling faintly of the judge's private study. He smoothed the paper against the table, his thumb tracing the official seal. The phone in his pocket vibrated. He didn't need to look to know it was Alina. The trap was set. The guest list was finalized. Every high-definition lens in the city would be focused on the podium at 8 o'clock tomorrow night. Arthur stood, his joints popping but his back straighter than it had been in years. He looked at the empty chair where Marcus had sat. "You're right about one thing, Marcus," he whispered to the empty air. "The stairs are steep, and it's a long, long way down." The evening arrived with a heavy, expectant stillness that seemed to cling to the marble pillars of the grand ballroom. Inside, the air was a curated blend of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of chilled champagne. Arthur moved through the crowd with the practiced invisibility of a man who had spent decades watching people from behind a prosecutor's desk. His tuxedo was 20 years old, the wool heavy and honest, a stark contrast to the shimmering, razor-thin silks draped over the men half his age. He felt the weight of the warrant in his inner pocket, a single sheet of paper that felt heavier than a lead slab. At the center of the room, Marcus was holding court. He looked every bit the conqueror, his teeth flashing white against a deep tan as he laughed at a joke he'd likely told 3 times already that night. He wore a watch that caught the light with every theatrical gesture, a rose-gold monstrosity that screamed of a bonus he hadn't earned. Cassie stood at his side, her smile fixed and brittle. She looked like a woman trying to convince herself the floor wasn't vibrating beneath her feet. Marcus spotted him then. He didn't just see Arthur, he targeted him. With a final, booming laugh to his circle of admirers, he began to weave through the crowd, his gait fueled by the arrogance of a man who believed he'd already won the war. He didn't offer a hand. He simply stood too close, invading the space Arthur had spent a lifetime defending. "You actually came," he said, his voice carrying just far enough to turn the heads of a nearby group of investors. He looked Arthur up and down, a sneer tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I wasn't sure if you'd have the heart for it. It's a long night for a man who's used to being in bed by 9. Maybe I should have arranged for a nurse to follow you around with a chair." Arthur didn't flinch. He let the insult hang in the air, watching the way the investors exchanged uncomfortable glances. He took a slow sip of his water, the cold condensation biting into his palm. "The air is a bit thin up here, isn't it, Marcus? It can make a man lightheaded, prone to making mistakes." Marcus laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the soft melody of the string quartet. "Mistakes! Look around you. This is success. This is power. While you've been busy playing detective with your old files, I've been building a kingdom. You're a relic, Arthur. A ghost haunting a house that doesn't belong to you anymore." He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon and unearned confidence. "I'm the one on the program tonight. You're just a guest on my wife's ticket. Try not to spill anything on yourself. It's a bad look for the family." He turned his back on Arthur before a response could be given, the ultimate gesture of dismissal. He returned to his circle, and Arthur heard him say, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "My father-in-law is a bit confused these days. Retirement hasn't been kind to his mind. We just try to keep him comfortable." A surge of heat flared in Arthur's chest, but he channeled it into the steady rhythm of his breathing. He looked across the room and found Alina Vance. She was dressed in a sleek, dark gown that hid the tactical gear she usually favored, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. She gave a single, microscopic nod. The digital trail was secured. The forensic audit of the Thorne accounts was currently sitting on a server, waiting for the command to go live on every screen in the hall. Arthur moved toward the head table, where Judge Harrison Reed sat. The judge looked up, his expression unreadable to the casual observer, but Arthur saw the grim set of his jaw. They had shared 1,000 silences in courtrooms, and this one was the loudest of all. Harrison placed a hand on the folder in front of him, the official record of the evening's honorees. "It's a fine gathering," Harrison said, his voice a low rumble. "A lot of people here to see a man get what he deserves." "More than he knows," Arthur replied. He felt a strange sense of calm. The rage was still there, a cold fire beneath his ribs, but it was directed now, purposeful. He watched Marcus Thorne climb the 3 steps to the stage, adjusting his tie in the monitor's reflection with a preening, self-satisfied smirk. The man truly believed he was untouchable. He believed the world was a series of locks he could pick with a smile and a lie. Cassie approached Arthur then, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch his sleeve. "Dad, please, don't make a scene. He is so happy tonight. He's worked so hard for this." Arthur looked at his daughter, seeing the shadows under her eyes that no amount of expensive makeup could hide. He saw the way she glanced toward the stage, her body tensing as her husband began to tap the microphone, the sound echoing through the hall like a gavel. "I'm not the one making the scene, Cassie," Arthur said softly. "I'm just the one turning on the lights." The house lights began to dim. A hush fell over the 300 guests, the rustle of silk and the clatter of silverware fading into a heavy, expectant silence. A spotlight cut through the darkness, finding Marcus as he stood behind the mahogany podium. He looked radiant, the golden light reflecting off his watch and the polished surface of the stage. He cleared his throat, a wide, triumphant grin spreading across his face as he looked out over the crowd. His audience, his witnesses, his victims. Arthur Sterling stepped back into the shadows near the tech booth. He felt the rough edge of the warrant against his chest. He looked at the massive projector screen behind the podium, which currently displayed a shimmering logo of the Thorne Group. In less than 5 minutes, that logo would be replaced by something much more permanent. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed, "please welcome our visionary of the year, Marcus Thorne." The applause was deafening. Marcus raised his hands, soaking in the adulation like a man dying of thirst. He leaned into the microphone, his eyes scanning the room until they found Arthur in the back. He winked, a final gesture of superiority. It was the final, fatal mistake of a man who didn't realize he was standing on a trapdoor. Arthur didn't wink back. He simply reached out and tapped the shoulder of the young technician standing at the console. "Now," he whispered. The hum of the projector changed from a steady drone to a sharp, electric whine as the screen behind the podium flickered. The visionary of the year, slide, with its airbrushed portrait of a grinning Marcus Thorne, vanished. In its place, a stark, high-resolution PDF of a Swiss bank ledger filled the 30-foot display. The room, previously a cacophony of clinking crystal and sycophantic laughter, went deathly silent. It was a vacuum of sound so sudden it made the ears ring. Marcus didn't notice at first. He was still basking in the warmth of the spotlight, his hand gripped tightly around the gold-plated award. He began to speak, his voice booming through the hidden speakers. "Success isn't just about the numbers," he started, his tone dripping with practiced humility. "It's about the legacy we—" He stopped. The silence of the audience had finally reached him, a cold tide rising from the front row. He turned his head slowly, the movement jerky and mechanical, to look at the screen behind him. His features didn't just shift, they underwent a violent, structural collapse. The arrogant light in his eyes vanished, replaced by a hollow, frantic glassiness as the blood drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. His mouth hung open in a jagged O. his lips twitching rhythmically as if trying to form a lie his brain could no longer synthesize. A bead of sweat broke from his hairline, carving a glistening path through his expensive foundation, while his shoulders slumped forward, the expensive tailoring of his tuxedo suddenly looking like a shroud for a much smaller, weaker man. His hand, still holding the award, began to tremble so violently that the gold plating rattled against his wedding ring. Arthur Sterling stepped out from the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains. He didn't rush. He moved with the measured, terrifying grace of a man who had spent 40 years watching criminals realize they were trapped. The smell of ozone from the projector and the faint, floral scent of the centerpiece lilies hung heavy in the air. At the front table, Cassie Sterling Thorne stood up so abruptly her chair scraped harshly against the marble floor. Her face was a mask of dawning horror as she looked from the screen, which now displayed Marcus's forged signatures on the Thorne Group pension fund transfers to her husband. She didn't say a word, but the way she pulled her hand away from the table, as if the very cloth were tainted, spoke volumes. Beside her, Judge Harrison Reed adjusted his spectacles, his silver eyebrows knitting together in a mask of judicial fury. He looked at the screen with the clinical detachment of a man reading a death warrant. Across the aisle, the CFO of the Thorne Group was already on his feet, his face a bright, mottled red as he began barking into his cell phone, his eyes locked on Marcus with predatory intent. 2 other board members physically recoiled, shifting their chairs inches away from the stage as if the man standing there were suddenly contagious. Arthur reached the edge of the stage. He didn't take the stairs. He stood on the floor level, looking up at the man who had tried to bury him. The silence was absolute, broken only by the jagged, wet sound of Marcus's panicked breathing. "The thing about shadows, Marcus," Arthur said, his voice calm and resonant, carrying to the very back of the ballroom without the need for a microphone, "is that they only exist as long as you can control the light." Marcus tried to speak. A pathetic, high-pitched wheeze escaped his throat. "Arthur, I can explain. This is a mistake, a technical." "It's not a mistake, it's a ledger," Arthur interrupted, his tone as cold as a winter grave. "Every cent you peeled away from the employees who trusted you. Every document you forged with my name while I sat in that hospital bed. It's all there, in black, white, and blood." Arthur looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the witnesses who were already beginning to pull out their phones to record the spectacle. The social currency Marcus had spent a lifetime building was evaporating in real time. "You once told me I was a relic who didn't understand how the modern world works," Arthur said, stepping back into the dim light of the aisle. "But justice isn't a relic, it's an inheritance, and tonight you're finally paying the debt." Arthur didn't wait for a rebuttal. He didn't stay to watch the security guards, already whispering into their sleeves at the back of the hall, begin their march toward the stage. He turned his back on the flickering screen and the broken man standing beneath it. As he walked toward the heavy oak exit doors, the first sounds of the coming storm, the shouts of the board members and the frantic clicking of cameras, erupted behind him. Arthur didn't look back. He had delivered his closing argument, and the verdict was already written on every face in the room. The silence that followed Arthur's departure from the stage was not empty. It was heavy, pressurized like the air before a terminal lightning strike. Marcus Thorne stood frozen under the harsh glow of the projector, his shadow cast long and distorted against the bank records that proved his ruin. For a heartbeat, the only sound in the cavernous hall was the rhythmic, metallic hum of the cooling fan in the projector, smelling of scorched dust and ozone. Then the sound of a single camera shutter clicked, sharp and final as a guillotine blade. It broke the spell. Marcus's skin didn't just pale. It turned a sickly, translucent gray, the color of wet ash. His eyes, usually sharp with a predator's arrogance, became glassy and unfocused, darting toward the exits as if searching for a hole in the floor to swallow him. His mouth hung open, a silent, pathetic O of disbelief, and a bead of sweat tracked a slow, jagged path from his temple down into the starched collar of his $5,000 suit. His hands, which had been gesturing with such grand authority only minutes ago, now clutched the edges of the mahogany podium with white-knuckled desperation. He was shaking so violently that the microphone picked up the rhythmic thrum of his terror, broadcasting the sound of his collapsing world to the entire room. "This is a fabrication," Marcus finally shrieked, his voice cracking, losing its practiced baritone. He looked toward the front row, searching for an ally, but found only a vacuum. "Arthur is a senile old man. He's bitter because I've surpassed him. These documents are forged." Judge Harrison Reed stood up from his seat at the center table. The movement was slow, deliberate, and carried the weight of 30 years on the bench. The room went even quieter if that were possible. The judge didn't look at the screen. He looked directly at the man on the stage with a gaze of profound disappointment. "I reviewed the originals myself this afternoon, Marcus," Harrison Reed said, his voice echoing with the authority of a death sentence. "The signatures are verified. The digital trail is unbroken. You weren't just stealing from the firm, you were stealing from the legacy Arthur spent 40 years building." Beside him, Detective Alina Vance stepped into the aisle. She didn't draw a weapon, but the way she adjusted her blazer to reveal the badge on her belt was more effective than any shout. Her eyes were locked on Marcus, cold and professional. She had been Arthur's finest protege for a reason. She knew exactly when the prey was cornered. The witnesses reacted with the visceral instinct of a herd sensing a predator's fall. The CEO of the Thorne Group, a man who had shared a stake with Marcus only last week, physically slid his chair 6 inches away, his face twisted in a mask of corporate revulsion. 2 board members were already on their phones, their hushed, frantic whispers about legal indemnity and immediate termination hissing through the air. Cassie Sterling Thorne sat in the middle of it all, her face a mask of porcelain shock. She looked at the man she had married, really looked at him, and the enabler's light in her eyes finally flickered and died. She didn't go to him. She didn't even speak. She simply placed her wedding ring on the white linen tablecloth and looked away. Marcus scrambled off the stage, nearly tripping on the stairs. He tried to push past Alina, his face contorted in a mask of frantic rage. "Get out of my way, you have no right, I'm going home. We'll settle this with my lawyers in the morning." "Home?" The voice came from the back of the hall. Arthur had stopped at the heavy oak doors. He turned, his silhouette framed by the hallway light. He looked younger than he had in years. The weight of the secret finally transferred to the shoulders of the man who deserved to carry it. Arthur reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a single, folded manila document. "I wouldn't head for the estate if I were you, Marcus," Arthur said, his voice calm, carrying easily through the stunned silence. Marcus stopped, his chest heaving. "What are you talking about? That house is mine. I put the down payment on it myself." "With money you embezzled from my daughter's trust," Arthur corrected, stepping back into the room just enough for the light to catch the cold steel in his eyes. "But more importantly, you stopped paying the secondary mortgage 3 months ago to fund your offshore accounts. The bank moved to foreclosed last week." Arthur walked forward, the sound of his shoes on the polished marble echoing like a countdown. He handed the document to Detective Vance, who passed it directly to Marcus. "I bought the debt, Marcus. Every cent of it," Arthur said. The wait for it moment stretched, the tension in the room reaching a snapping point. "The house, the cars, even the furniture you haven't paid off yet. It all belongs to the Sterling estate now." Marcus looked down at the paper. It was an eviction notice, signed and stamped, effective immediately. "You can't do this," Marcus whispered, the last of his bravado evaporating. "Where am I supposed to go?" Arthur didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He simply adjusted his cuffs, the image of a man who had finally balanced the ledgers. "That's no longer my concern," Arthur said. "But I believe the precinct has a very small, very cold room waiting for you. Alina." As the handcuffs clicked shut, a sound of finality that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards, Arthur turned his back on the wreckage of Marcus Thorne's life. He didn't wait to see the security guards lead the broken man out through the service entrance. He walked out the main doors and into the cool night air, leaving the storm he had created to wash away the last of the filth. He had delivered his verdict, and for the first time in a decade, Arthur Sterling felt the sun beginning to rise. 6 months had passed since the storm broke, and the silence that followed was far more expensive than Arthur Sterling had anticipated. He sat in his new office, a modest, wood-paneled suite in a pre-war building far removed from the glass towers of the financial district. There was no chrome here, no floor-to-ceiling windows to remind him of the heights from which his enemies had fallen. Instead, the air smelled of old leather and the faint, comforting bitterness of dark roast coffee. He adjusted his spectacles, looking down at the final report from the receivership. The Thorne empire hadn't just collapsed, it had been dismantled with surgical precision. Every offshore account Marcus Thorne had hidden, every fraudulent deed he had forged, and every penny he had siphoned from the Sterling Trust had been clawed back. A soft knock at the door preceded Detective Alina Vance. She wasn't in uniform today, but the sharp alertness in her eyes remained. She dropped a heavy manila folder onto his desk, the sound echoing like a gavel. "It's over, Arthur," she said, her voice lacking its usual professional edge. "The sentencing came down an hour ago. 10 years, no possibility of early release. Judge Harrison Reed made sure the financial crimes were stacked consecutively with the evidence of witness tampering." Arthur didn't smile. He simply nodded, his fingers tracing the edge of a silver fountain pen. "And the restitution. Every cent is being diverted to the foundation you set up for the families Marcus defrauded," she replied. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him. "You don't look like a man who just won the biggest case of his life." "Justice is a ledger, Alina," he said quietly. "The numbers are balanced, but the paper is still scarred." Later that afternoon, he found himself standing behind a thick pane of reinforced glass. The visiting room smelled of industrial floor wax and the stale, recycled air of a cage. When the heavy steel door at the far end groaned open, a man stepped through who bore almost no resemblance to the sales director who had once sneered at Arthur's modest shoes. Marcus Thorne looked small. The orange jumpsuit was several sizes too large for his gaunt frame, the fabric pilled and rough against his skin. His hair, once perfectly coiffed, was buzzed short, revealing a jagged scar near his temple he'd hidden for years with expensive styling. He sat down, his movements jerky and uncertain. He didn't reach for the phone. He just stared at his hands that no longer wore a $50,000 watch, but were instead stained with the ink of the prison laundry detail. Arthur picked up the receiver. He waited until Marcus finally looked up. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, flickering fear. "I didn't come to gloat," Arthur said, his voice amplified by the cold electronic hum of the line. Marcus let out a dry, rattling breath. "Then why? To see the wreckage." "To tell you that Cassie is safe," Arthur replied. "She's in Vermont. She started her own practice. She doesn't use your name anymore." Marcus flinched as if he'd been struck. The mention of his wife, the woman he had gaslit and used as a shield, seemed to be the only thing that could still pierce his armor. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked around the sterile, gray room, the reality of his next decade settling into his bones. He was a man defined by status, and here he was less than a number. "You said I was a sleeping lion," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You were wrong. I was just a father waiting for his daughter to see the truth. Now that she has, you are irrelevant." Arthur hung up the phone before Marcus could respond. He watched for a moment as the guards led the broken man away. Marcus's shoulders slumped, his feet shuffling in cheap plastic sliders. The face slap wasn't a single moment anymore. It was the slow, agonizing realization that Marcus would spend the prime of his life in a world where his charm and his lies held no currency. Leaving the facility, Arthur drove to a small park overlooking the bay. Cassie Sterling Thorne was waiting for him on a bench near the water. She looked different. The frantic, haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a weary peace. They sat in silence for a long time, the sound of the waves hitting the pier providing the only soundtrack. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly, watching a seagull dive into the gray water. Arthur looked at his daughter. He thought of the years of deception, the stress that had aged him, and the bridge between them that was still under heavy repair. He thought of the cost, the loss of the quiet retirement he had once envisioned. "I regret that it was necessary," he said, "but I would burn the world down again to keep you from a man like that." Cassie reached out, taking his hand. Her grip was firm, a new strength radiating from her. They weren't the same people they had been before Marcus entered their lives. They were harder, perhaps a little colder, but they were whole. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the grass, Arthur stood up. He felt the weight of the last year finally begin to dissipate, replaced by the steady, unyielding foundation of a life reclaimed. The ledger was closed. The verdict was final. He turned his back on the prison in the distance and walked with his daughter toward the car, leaving the ghosts of the Thorne name to rot in the dark.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.